It's a great joy today to welcome Dr. Brad Strawn as our guest on Conversing. Brad is the Evelyn and Frank Fried Professor of Integration of Psychology and Theology and the Chair of Integration in the Department of Doctoral Psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary. We're really so grateful, Brad, that you could join us. Thank you very much.
Glad to be here.
We had a conversation that we did earlier this year in anticipation of the election, and it was a conversation that was really talking about just the way that the insights of psychology and theology can be brought together in a way to help us understand how to approach a time like this and then how to prepare for it. Now we're on the other side of the election. At the moment that we're having this conversation, election results on the national presidential election have not yet been announced or settled. A lot of state and regional elections, of course, have been set, but not on the national level. So the nation at this moment is still in suspension about how that's going to turn out. And there's a lot of drama that's unfolding, as there has been in the United States political scene for the last several years, especially. So I really am so grateful that we can have a follow-on conversation. This is sort of a part two to our earlier part one. And now we're in a different moment. And in the past, when we had the conversation, it was really in anticipation. Now we're on the other side, but in suspension. So give us, as you are seeing it play out on the national stage, just give us a sense of how to even describe what you think is happening emotionally and psychologically for people. I know that's a huge generalization. I'm not thinking you can speak with perfect scholarship about that, but I'm just curious what your insights would be.
Well, right. I think we're seeing a continuation of a lot of the things we saw prior to the election, which is a lot of feelings, a lot of emotions. I think, as I mentioned in the last time we chatted, that sometimes it's hard to identify or name those feelings. We get caught up in things like policy or talking about the character of one of the candidates or their past dealings, what they're, what are they going to do in the office? Those are all, again, really important things. But I think what really drives a lot of what's going on, both before the election and now, is really at the psychological level. It's issues of fear, I think deep sense of fear and deep sense of anxiety on either side of the political fence. And so now you add waiting, now you add another level of we don't know what's going to happen. And not only are we not yet to the 270, but there's talks of lawsuits and recounts and that sort of thing. And it's like you're taking a nation who's already anxious and you're just kind of keep raising the stakes. So as I look around, what I see a lot in all the vitriolic, conversations, everything else is really fear and anxiety.
And so it's really largely the same elements, but just escalated or intensified in some way.
Yeah. And it's more because it's more real, like, our candidate may really lose. And so all the fears we had cooked up ahead of time, now they may really come to fruition.
So what does that do to our imaginations? Does the further waiting just cause us to go still further out in what we've sort of speculated and internalized as a possible danger, or does it morph in that way? I'm just curious how it unfolds. As it escalates, does it kind of morph in some way?
I think there's the possibility for morphing. There's a lot of obviously individual variation in terms of how each person will kind of experience this. I think we might see some people become numb as a kind of defense mechanism against, extended anxiety and fear. Any of the regular defense mechanisms that you might use when you're anxious will come into play. So people might be drinking more, they might be binging Netflix more, they might be engaging in maladaptive coping mechanisms, but they may also engage in adaptive coping mechanisms. I know a lot of people who are just saying, I can only take so many minutes a day of this online or on the television, and then I have to do something else. I have to go and I have to, reconstitute myself in some ways. But I think you see a ratcheting up of anxiety. I think you'll see a defensive numbing or just protective measure. And then I think you'll also see some adaptive responses to it.
So, Brad, just tell us a little bit more about your own emotional journey in this. So I really don't know because we have not overtly discussed the election. I don't have any presupposition about anything about your particular points of view. So I'm not trying to draw you into that conversation so much as I am just, how would you map your own emotions in this time?
Yeah, no, it's a fair, good question. This whole, the state of political discourse in the United States, and particularly among Christians, has been very disheartening to me. And being, a part-time pastor as well, there's been a lot of hurt, a lot of shade thrown, if you will, in the Christian community. People's character being assassinated. Some of my own colleagues in various settings have been really disparaged by people, and that's been really painful. And so I carry a deep grief about the conflict. And then I find myself going back and forth, like I imagine most of us do, right? I get upset, I get angry, I get what I consider righteous indignation. And then my defense mechanism is to flee. When we get anxious, we can fight, flee, or freeze. And I'm a fleer primarily. So after I fight for a little while and maybe say something I shouldn't have, then I want to flee. And so I think part of my challenge is to stay enough involved where I can be helpful and know what's going on and speak where things need to be spoken to, and protect those, or be part of, thinking about those who maybe don't have a voice, speaking up there, but also not becoming so overwhelmed that I then disappear and I'm not helpful to anyone. Mm-hmm. So I have, and we may get to this later, but I have really, it's the perfect conversation for the integration of psychology and theology.
Absolutely,
because,
yes.
What has really helped me is, kind of leaning into some of the things I believe about self-regulation and psychological understandings of affect, but then also really, really leaning into a theological understanding of life and death, frankly, and hospitality. And so I feel like I've reached, at least for this moment, it could change tomorrow. But right now I feel like I'm in a pretty peaceful place, which has been really important for me as well, because, working with clients in my private practice or with lay people at my church or colleagues or students at Fuller, we need some people that are somewhat peaceful, at least for moments at a time.
Right, exactly. Not everyone is necessarily familiar with the language or the ideas of self-regulation. Just tell us a little bit more about that so that then I can ask a little more questions about that.
Yeah, sure. So, we all have different levels of self-regulation. And what I'm referring to there is our ability to name, manage, and regulate our emotions. And so a lot of that has to do with, some of it's biological in nature, we know, and then a good amount of it is the way in which emotions were dealt with and handled in our family of origin. And then even out from that in our cultural context, researchers show us that race and culture and ethnicity, also different races deal with emotions differently, for example, and express them differently, even though we may share common emotions. And so we often talk about if a person becomes overwhelmed by their emotion, we refer to that as dysregulated. And what that essentially means is at the level of the brain, the parts of the brain, the amygdala, the limbic system that really has to do with emotions, becomes so powerful that it sort of shuts down the frontal lobe of the brain, which is more to do with reasoning and thinking and logic and sequencing and those sorts of things. And all you have to do probably is think about a time you were really deeply involved in an argument where you lost your cool. And that would be an example of becoming dysregulated. And a lot of people are becoming dysregulated in the political sphere. And it happens on Facebook and on Twitter and everywhere else, as well as in person. And so what we have become to understand there are ways that we can become more equipped at managing and naming and regulating our emotions. And so that's what we refer to as emotional regulation.
So say a little bit more about what some of those practices can be that can help us practice self-regulation.
Right. Well, the big one for me, the first one, is to try to be able to really name what's going on. So instead of saying those jerks over there that are so terrible and they need to be wiped off the face of the earth, I'm anxious, I'm afraid, I'm nervous, and I'm going into, once you can name that, then you can begin to acknowledge what kinds of behaviors follow from that.
Right.
So that's a really important first step. Then the next step is really then to deal with the emotions that you're feeling. It's okay to be anxious. It's okay to be afraid. But if you're overwhelmed by those, then they're not even really going to serve the function that they're there for. So we have to find ways to kind of not suppress them by any stretch of the imagination. But again, the term is to regulate, to kind of pull them down, to bring them down to where we can do things with them. So sometimes a lot of the work around this has been done with things like mindfulness and mentalization, which is just calming the body, your body and your mind. If you get one calm, the other one starts to follow. And so deep breaths, what grandma told us to count to 10. But also things
which is a form of self-regulation.
Exactly.
Right?
It's exactly
I'm
that.
Just drawing that connection.
Yes. But a lot of this has to do also with what we're doing when we're not at the height of our dysregulation. So a lot of people are doing, like I said, mindfulness exercises now, or just making time and space to be in places where you're not overly stimulated. So sit and read your book, have your contemplative prayer, read scripture, be with a friend that you really enjoy. Whatever those kinds of things are that actually bring down the autonomic nervous system can be really helpful. We can build those capacities in ourselves.
Which is pretty amazing, given that it doesn't feel like you can do anything about them when it's actually happening, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So let me give you an example. There's somebody that very occasionally interacts with me online. He's a person that I know in my past who was the child of a family that I knew well, but I've never really spent any time with him. We've never been personally in the same space, except just in a very, very casual, short way. So, but every once in a while I feel dive bombed by him online. And usually he makes a statement that I would say is brief, but almost always quite condemning. So it's sort of this proclamation of, this thing that you have just said or done is wrong in the world, period. And it's said with an attitude that I think is unmistakable. I don't think it's just me. I think anybody would read it and say, ouch, what is that? I don't know what it is. And I've offered several times to have either an online or telephone conversation, or to write back and forth, because I want to understand what his point of view is, that kind of thing. He's never responded to any of those invitations. So I have no idea whether he has rejected them, or I suppose technically whether I think he's seen them, although I can't imagine that he hasn't seen them. But in any case, so it is just interesting to acknowledge that when I see his post, I do feel a surge, right? It's like, oh gosh, I don't really want to read this post. I always read it. As I say, it's very brief. And it is almost always in the same kind of zone of critique and the same kind of certain pointing a finger. Now, in fairness, he believes that something I've written has done the same thing. Right. Although he would say it's done it wrongly. And I'm sure he would say that what he's saying back to me is fair and legitimate and reasonable, right? Yes. I think he would say, I am being self-regulated. I would say my non-responsiveness, I've determined never to respond to him, even on the same day that I first read the first thing. If I'm going to respond to him, then it's a brief response. And it's usually an invitational response. Like, I'd love to understand what's behind what you're saying. So, but the surge is so real. I mean, when it happens, it's like, oh my gosh. And as I was following the electoral map, I will also confess that I was aware of the status of his state. Like, I was watching in particular whether his state was going, I think, in the direction he clearly wanted it to go. So I say all that and then say, so what would you say about any of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're exactly describing the process that I think all of us are going through in a variety of ways. Again, individual variations being as they are. But when we feel attacked, this is a survival mechanism, right? As I mentioned earlier, we go into fight or flee or freeze. And trauma people tell us there's even some more variations on all of those that I won't go into all at this moment, but we're seeing a lot of fighting, right? Especially on social media. I mentioned that I can sometimes be a fleer, and so I have to decide, is my non-response actually regulation, or am I just fleeing and I don't want to deal with it?
Yes.
So that's what's happening, and it happens at the autonomic nervous system. I mean, we are embodied creatures, and we feel with our bodies. Right. We like to think of ourselves as sort of minds and bodies, but we're really bodies. And so this is why meditation or mindfulness is so very important, because it gets you back in touch with your physiological arousal. So you become aroused, and then there's some behavior that wants to happen, and you've been able to resist that behavior, probably for a variety of reasons. And then you're able to come back in a more regulated way and respond with an invitation. And I really think that that's one of the best ways that we can go about it, particularly as people of faith who want, in fact, to dialogue rather than debate. On his side, he's being triggered by all sorts of things, right? And so when he gets triggered, he goes after you because you're the one who has upset his cultural worldview. You're the one now who's become threatening to his sense of safety in the world. And so he's got to get rid of your idea, get rid of your credibility, and in the worst case scenario, get rid of you.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good summary of exactly how it works. And I think, like many people earlier in social media days, I was more prone to make a quick response. And I have learned, I suppose this is a form of self-regulation, to say, if I really am triggered, then I'm definitely not going to respond right now.
Right.
I need to walk away, or I need to just let it sit. It doesn't normally take a whole day, but in this particular case, I've just decided as a personal discipline that giving it a day is a good thing. I will respond better tomorrow.
I love it.
But I think, we all live in a world where speedy self-regulation is what's really being demanded or expected.
Right.
Or the abandonment of self-regulation in the name of speed and immediacy. Right.
Right. Well, I have a theory, which I could just give you really quickly. There may be someone else who's talked about this, and I just haven't come across it yet. But I have this feeling that our technology is evolving faster than we as humans are evolving. And what I mean by that is even around our emotional capacities, right? So whereas, if we were to have a conflict with someone in person, often that requires a little bit of a buildup. We're kind of in each other's space. We've been around each other. We've bumped into each other. There's a sort of building of that. Now with the speed and the rapidity with what happens online, there's no time for us to regulate, I think, in the ways that we might have been able to 20, 30 years ago. And so like you were referring to, it's like it's demanding more from us than we can actually do. And so we have to put things in place. Another thing I was thinking about, Mark, was in marital therapy. We use the concept of a marital timeout, which is, when couples become emotionally flooded, when they become dysregulated, and we help them identify what that looks like, we say you have to take 20 minutes apart from each other, because it takes 20 minutes just for your body to physiologically calm down. Wow. And, a lot of couples think, oh, well, we're smart, highly educated people. We can talk through this. And we have to say, no, you actually can't talk through it.
Because you're talking against your biology.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what happens then after whatever the time period, 20 minutes ish? What has happened? Just describe that a little bit so people understand it. What's happened in that 20-minute period?
Well, the whole autonomic nervous system begins to calm down. So, the research has been done on this is really fascinating because they take couples and they hook them up to blood pressure cuffs and heart monitors, and they put special sensors on their chairs so they can tell how they're fidgeting and moving around, and they videotape the whole thing.
Wow.
And what they find out is after that 20 minutes, like blood pressure has come down, heart rate has gone down, galvanic skin response, how much we're sweating, right, has decreased. And those are all physiological markers of emotionality. So we can literally see the body calm down, which is the good news. The body doesn't want to live at high rates of anxiety.
Right.
It will calm down if we give it the space.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's what happens. And then, of course, the frontal lobe of our brains can kick back in, and no longer is the limbic system, the emotional system of the brain, running the show. Now we can think again. Now, what I have to teach couples is that you might need to take 3 or 4 timeouts before this conversation reaches fruition. But that's okay.
Right.
That's just how it is.
It's sort of like forgiving 70 times 7.
Exactly.
There's practice sometimes in these things.
Perfect. Yeah, it is practice for sure.
Yeah. This is, I think, partly then why I've personally felt, even though we're in isolation already, and my life and our lives, most of our lives are virtual. At the same time, I still felt like I've wanted less time on the screen, less time talking to people, more time in quiet, less triggering by conversations that feel like they're simply going to exaggerate whatever it is that I might already be feeling, or conflict with whatever it is that I'm feeling, neither one of which actually feels very useful to me. It feels like I just need to be quieter than that. I need to take time for silence, take time for slower and different activity. I need to slow down my physiology in some ways so that it feels quieted, even though I'm not necessarily having it doing it in relationship to a moment of overt conflict. The whole trauma of the season feels so big that it just feels like you just continue to want to quiet down so that you're in a different space. For me, that has been, it's just been interesting watching what I've been doing. I think my body tells me this is what you need to be doing. I think it's less like I've been making a rational decision. I'm just aware that my instincts are, I need to operate differently in this period of time.
And that's very hard because a lot of people can't listen to their body or listen to their instincts.
Right.
And they just keep going.
Right. And a lot of people's lives and worlds don't allow for it. Our children are grown. I'm not having to leave the house for some essential job.
That's right.
Those are all privileges of their own kind that allow me to do this. But if you're needing this, but your actual circumstances literally don't allow it, it's very, very difficult. Right.
And I think that's part of the challenge too for me of how do we try to find ways to be calm? How do we find ways, even again theologically, to think about these things, but not in such a way that it takes us away from the gravity of what's really being done. Right. Because as you just alluded to, certain of us in certain levels of privilege can do certain things that other people can't.
Right.
And so this means that it really matters.
Right.
And so how do we not get overly, you see people doing really good work who are stressed out, maxed out, and eventually they're going to burn out. Right. And so the work they're doing needs to be done. I think it's a Christian thing. It's a psychologically healthy thing. But also, how do we do it in a way that doesn't wreck us as we're trying to make sure that there's justice for all.
Right. And this is where the jokes and non-jokes that you see on social media about mothers who are just hoping for 5 minutes in the bathroom alone without their children right around them, that kind of intensity of just a continuous feeling of pressure and of demand and of neediness and all of that, while you're still trying to function with your own separated, individuated emotions that may not be at all attached, let's say, to anything that's happening per se to your children. But that's all happening in real time while you're also trying to absorb some other national news or other piece of this seasonal drama that we're in, as well as long-term drama that the nation is in over issues of justice that have to be sustained because things have to be changed.
Right.
So let's project forward a little bit. As we've said, we're just right in that in-between time. We're recording this on Thursday after the election happened on Friday. And I say that specifically to say, so that's where we are, just for those who are hearing this, whenever it is that you're perhaps giving an ear to this podcast. But by next week, let's just imagine, or to be even safer, let's just imagine it's the next week that we have not only the election and recounts or whatever it is that's going to be going on, and probably most of the court cases will have been settled in some way. We'll be faced with some kind of news. We'll, depending on our political point of view, we'll have a reaction to that. Now we're settling into something like a normal that has to be about coping with this reality, whatever the reality is. Give us some clues about that. Feels like a somewhat different moment than we're not in this waiting anymore. We will have some degree of reliable knowledge or whatever it is that we're going to call it.
Right.
But because the nature of the circumstances are such that there's such ongoing political anxiety and division, some of this will continue. So on one hand, I'm assuming you would say, well, the self-regulation and the other factors that you've mentioned, fear and anxiety, will continue, but now it will have to be handled in a context that's either a continuity of what we've been experiencing in recent years or a discontinuity. And it might involve the same people or the flipped sense. That's people who were before were fearful or less fearful or whatever. I don't know. Just comment into that new dimension in 2 weeks, let's say.
Certainly, I'll try. I think that what you're pointing toward is maybe the importance of a kind of psychological acceptance of what is.
Yes, right.
And there is, we have one actual school of psychotherapy called ACT, ACT, and the first letter A stands for acceptance, which is literally accepting what is. It's not quite like, ever since I gave up hope, I feel much better. But it's not sort of rehashing, right? It's not trying to, it's sort of like, constantly arguing a point that even if you won, it wouldn't change the outcome. Right. And so, whatever side, again, whatever president or group you voted for, someone's going to be declared the victor at some point. And that is going to be painful for a whole group of people. But I think what's important, in addition, again, to the ongoing affect regulation kinds of things that we're talking about, is a kind of acceptance. This is what is, and now what do we do? Humans have an amazing capacity to worry about things that haven't happened yet. Right. So the very least we can do is accept what has happened and then decide, okay, now how do we work within this system? I think we've been seeing people do that, again, during the last 4 years in the United States. Things have come to light. Some new things for people. Some people, they've been new. For others, they haven't been new at all. And so I think very brave, courageous people have said, okay, this is the reality. This is what it is. And now how do we work in line with our commitments and our values to make changes given what is? I find those people often to be more grounded, actually, less anxious, not less concerned, and not less maybe angry at times, but they're clear, right? Like, this is what it is, and now this is what we need to do. And I think that's a great example of affect regulation. And I want to mention again, because I believe that humans don't just think all by ourselves. We actually think with other people. I fully believe that we regulate with other people. And so another wonderful way for affect regulation, and another wonderful way when this is all said and done, is to make sure you're in supportive communities, where you can say, okay, here's the reality. Now, given our values and our core commitments, what will we do about that?
And that's partly where the rhythm, for example, of church attendance, which has been disrupted by COVID, makes the ability as a community to feel like you're coming together with your community. Now, that we pause on that because, of course, both of us would say sometimes those communities are really just another word for tribes, which are about social homogeneity. But leaving that in the picture, perhaps, nevertheless, we find being together with our community, however we're going to define that, as reassuring. It helps bring us into regulation, if that's the right word, into regulation inside a larger narrative than simply our own inner narrative.
Right. And I think we do see communities. I mean, this is discouraging, but we do see communities of anxiety. We do see communities. We see them. We can look outside our window right now, practically, and find these communities. And that's terribly unfortunate. But I do think the truth is that on whatever side of the coin you are, if there can be a reduction in fear and a reduction in anxiety, there is the possibility of beginning to have true dialogue with one another. Now, I think, again, as people of faith, there's some really important things for us to think about that as well, right? And I think it's those things that may bring Christians together who are on very opposite sides of the coin. So I don't want to suggest, and I think you're speaking to this, Mark, that community is going to fix everything.
Right.
But what I'm suggesting is that community can be a place of affect regulation where we can become less afraid. And I'm really convinced, and I think there's a lot of research to back this up, that fear is at the very bottom rung of things like othering, isms of all kinds, and even violence in our world. And so we've got to find ways to bring down our fear, bring down our anxiety, and mutual regulation is one of those possibilities.
Right. So let me bring up one of the things that I think many, many people everywhere along the political spectrum are talking about that I think would be really helpful to discuss. And that is that certainly in the two stereotypes of the left and the right, there is on both sides a stunning, pervasive sense of mystery about the other. Like, I just simply do not understand those who are on that other side, whatever it is. Right. And there's a very deep sense of that. There's kind of the stereotypical issues, but then there's this feeling that I've certainly heard this week from people on the right and on the left who look at the other side, as it were, the big swaths of red or the big swaths of blue, and say, I just do not get it. I don't understand how they could even see the world the way that it seems as though they are seeing the world. And in that, there's a level at times of just perhaps cheap condemnation and othering, as you're saying. But on the other hand, there's also this genuine sense that I hear of people saying, I just really do not understand how you could see the world in the way that they do, whatever that might be. Then there's emotions, of course, that immediately get kicked up about that, right? I assess that, or I respond to that emotionally. So take us into that particular version of this anxiety, fear dynamic.
Right. Well, it's interesting, right? Because we say, I don't understand how they could think that way. And I think that's maybe the wrong question or the wrong statement. Of course, you don't understand why they think that way, but could you somehow understand why they might feel that way?
Right.
What it is, again, they're feeling. I would love to sit, and I would love to encourage people to sit with one another, and when these conversations begin, to really kind of look deeply in each other's eyes and say, what is it that you fear the most in this life? And that would be an interesting conversation, because I'm pretty convinced then that all the rhetoric, all the, why we need to build a wall, or, why Black Lives Matter, or again, whatever side of whatever issue you're on, I think what you would find out is that there are these deeply shared core values about self-preservation. And I think we can often understand that. It's like we
Right.
don't hopefully yell at little children when they're frightened.
Mm-hmm.
We say, come here, I understand. Oh, I know. Right. And then from there, we can begin to make sense sort of as adults and as our frontal lobes kick back in. But as I said earlier, I'm so convinced that the bottom of this is like a kind of terror, practically.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I've said that phrase numerous times. I can't understand. And with this being the case, how could that be the case? Or how could
Right.
this person say that and then they say this about that? And there's some of this is going on right now, even around the election. It's just, and you say, like I'll say, it's mind blowing. But if I step back and I say, wow, there must be so much fear about that.
Mm-hmm.
If this president wins, people fear that this is going to happen. And if this president wins, or this candidate, I guess I should be saying, then this fear is going to happen.
Right. Right.
And I really think that's at the level where the real psychological action is. And it brings me back to, again, then what is it that Christians should fear? What is the place of fear in the Christian life?
Right.
And what is our relationship to fear? Fear calls us to possess and to cling and to hold on to. I think the gospel story and the identity we see in Jesus Christ is one who doesn't possess even his own identity, but he receives it as gift and lives out from it towards others. And I like to say to Christians, if all of our life is a gift, we literally have nothing to lose.
Right.
And so we don't have to be afraid, even though I know we're going to be afraid. I mean, it's the paradox, right?
Yes.
Our bodies do this. It's not wrong to be afraid. Jesus says, don't be anxious. But I think, he knew we were going to be anxious.
Right.
But it's an appeal to a remembering and a knowing about something more. And so that's some of the stuff that I've been going through that I think has brought some peace and calm to my own life, is that, again, while these things really matter, they're not also the final mattering. And I don't just mean because I'm going to escape someday and go to heaven. I mean that there's a different king, there's a different kingdom. What I have is only gift, not to be possessed. And there's a certain kind of freedom from fear that comes with that.
That's very, very helpful. All that is extremely helpful, I think. I bet that there are probably a lot of people listening to this podcast who are troubled about the future of America and are wanting to be agents of unity, understanding, compassion. They are located in different places around the country, perhaps, and some are certainly international. Sorry to all the international people that we're talking so admittedly today about what's happening in the United States. We don't normally do that, but given what's happening, it's understandable. But let's imagine that there are people who are saying, okay, so whatever has happened, whatever the presidential outcome. And I'm in the process of accepting that. I'm in a series of relationships. I'm trying to figure out, what does it mean in this moment to step into that with as little fear as, by God's grace, I can bring to the table, and with as much readiness to be candid and honest about my own underlying fears and anxieties that may have shaped the way I see the election and responded to the outcome. Just give us a few tangible steps when we have been really attending to our own process, but we're now going to enter into conversation with people who may or may not. And in any case, they are, of course, entitled to their own story and their own narrative and experience. So how do we walk into that? I'm assuming for the moment, we're talking about people that we know. We're walking into it and we know that there's going to be differences. We've already probably known that for some time, but we're not wanting to now bring, quote, the election to it. We're trying to bring something deeper that's healing. What is there to potentially try to hold in our minds when we're in those situations, or in our feelings in those situations?
Right. Well, again, I think that if we can be cognizant of our similarities, both in terms of, desires as well as fears. The hopeful side of me says we can find a lot of commonality with one another. Again, I don't, one of my friends listened to the first podcast and said, I love your optimism, which I don't typically think of myself as a super optimistic person, but I am hopeful, which is different, I think. Right.
Right.
So I think it's by practicing a kind of radical hospitality, which comes from this place of not having to be afraid. And, so for example, here at Fuller, we've, our faculty, staff, and students, we've made a really concerted effort over the last number of years. We've always been, culturally minded, but we've pushed ourselves harder to be more and more culturally sensitive around racial issues, ethnicity, all sorts of things. And so that means, in some sense, steeping yourself in reading about, memoirs, knowing people, spending time in settings maybe that you haven't, listening to podcasts, for example, that maybe you haven't, all sorts of things. That begins to build, I think, a kind of familiarity, a kind of knowing, a kind of openness, which can lead to hospitality, which then I think can begin to hopefully break down some of the barriers. I saw this, I don't know if it was on CBS Sunday Morning or what it was on this last weekend about these two families that live next door to one another, and one were Trump people and one were Biden people. I don't know if you saw them, and every week they have dinner together as families with their children, and right next to their the Biden sign and the Trump sign, they have homemade signs that say, "I love my neighbor," with an arrow pointing at each other.
Nice.
And it's on the news because it seems so unusual.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was thinking about those families today, thinking, I wonder how they're doing right now.
Yes, right.
And how they will do in the weeks to come. But I have a feeling, again, it's because they know each other and they've developed these relationships. And this is not, the other thing we do, which we know, right, is we tend to, we equate someone who supports one side with all the worst qualities of that side.
Yes, right.
And so, I always laugh when people talk about, the whatever,
yes.
Because there's just so many people that are literally in the middle. And the other day I was imagining, a troubled Democrat who's voting Democrat, but is troubled by it, right? And vice versa on the Republican side. But they're just trying to do their very best. And I think that's the kind of situation a lot of us will find ourselves in, is given, again, what has taken place, the thrownness of life that we now find ourselves in. Can we regulate? Can we live with less fear? Can we put ourselves in positions where we're learning from the other becomes a person and a name? I think that changes us over time. I have to stay with the liberation psychologists who say dialogue can change the world. Yes. But it actually has to be dialogue.
Right. Which involves empathy in part, a capacity to enter into each other's. Yeah, I was thinking about how much this is an empathy formational and empathy testing moment, right? Even more than the things leading up to the election. I can imagine a conversation with a lot of people who may or may not see the world the way I do it, that would go something like this. So the elections happened. This is where we are, whatever the outcome has been. Let me tell you the fears that I had and the fears that I now have. And I would love to hear you tell me what yours are.
Yeah.
I really want to understand, and it feels like the way forward as a nation is just not going to be to simply align around our fears, but to actually understand each other's fears, especially across places of typical division. Now, I feel like I know a fair number of people who might hold quite different visions of reality than I do, who would be willing to have that conversation, as long as it's a mutual conversation around me as well as the other person being willing to actually own my fears. Yeah. And if the conversation can go this way, which might not be fruitful, but it would depend on the person, I could imagine saying, tell me what your fears were had it gone the other way.
Yeah.
And I think that isn't always easy. I get it. And you can get in fairly quickly into a firestorm. But if you're with a person that is able, partly because of self-regulation, to simply be able to have some kind of capacity to name these things and to discuss them a little more dispassionately than rawly, it'll be very interesting. I think up to now, it's felt like the battle line because you're really trying to win something.
Yeah.
Once that's kind of off the table, nobody's arguing anymore about winning that, at least not in this past election. So now, going forward, how do we hold this? Can create a space, I think, for the things that you've been describing. But it requires empathy.
Yeah.
I want to actually hear and understand what you think and feel, not just what I think and feel.
Exactly. And I think that's where talking at the level of emotions is a way to get to the issue of empathy.
Right.
Because now I hear you saying, I'm afraid for my children.
Right.
Okay, well, I get being afraid for my children.
Right.
I can empathize with that. Now tell me how you think that was going to play out.
Right.
And I think suddenly we're on equal ground. That do or done to thing, right? That conflictual thing really happens when we've lost empathy for the other, and the other is no longer really even a kind of a person. In the worst case scenario, they're an ideology, they're an opponent, they're the enemy. Right. And as I said, I think lots of researchers and philosophers have said this is the seedbed for violence in the world. If I can dehumanize the other, which means I have to completely detach from any empathic feelings towards them, then I'm capable of destroying them. And I think we're all capable of that.
Right. Brad, this has been extremely helpful to me, and I think illuminating in various ways. So thank you very much. I'll be interested, of course, to watch how this does unfold in the nation, and especially in the American church in all of its manifestations. Yes. And we may need to do a part 3 of this at some time in the next year, where we look back and say, okay, so now we've come through the election, we've come through the immediate post-election implications. We're on the other side of whatever January is going to hold as an inauguration. Mm-hmm. And then we are maybe into the spring. We can look back and say, so where have we come to? And how much is the work the same or different?
Yeah, what grade do we get?
Yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh. Well, may the grace of God be with you and with all who are listening. Thank you so much for this time together. And I look forward to our ongoing conversations. So
enjoyed being with you.